I apologize that I will speak in English rather than in German. I do understand a fair bit of German, and a simple conversation in German is possible, but actually doing a presentation or being part of a discussion in German is something that I find quite difficult. Now, if I were here for a couple of weeks, then much of my German would come back. But thank you very much for allowing me to speak in English. And thank you for arranging such a good translator. I understand that you have enlisted the best translator that you have around. We are going to talk about diversity and unity during this weekend. And that is this evening a short introduction to that theme. Diversity in Christianity and diversity in Adventism. A short introduction this evening, which will be the basis on which we can build tomorrow. There is a lot of diversity. There always has been a lot of diversity in the past. Much of it has to do with the movement of people. It started in my country, for instance, with the Germanic tribes moving into an empty space and building what was the beginnings of Holland. There have been movements of peoples always in ancient times, entire peoples who were displaced by ancient rulers. There was the colonization in Greek and Roman times, barbaric invasions in the Middle Ages. We all know about the Vikings. I don't know whether they came as far as Switzerland, I don't think so, but they did come to quite a few places in Europe and beyond, probably to the United States, or what we call the United States now. Movement of people because of the colonization by Western nations. Displacements as results of wars, and of course today's problem of migration, asylum, economic migrants, etc., etc. There has always been this pattern of movement that has increased the diversity of communities, the diversity of populations all over the world. There has also been a diversity in Christianity. Not only, of course, was Christianity different from the non-Christian religions, but the idea that the church was ever monolithic, was ever everybody thinking the same, is a myth. The early church was diverse, more diverse than many people think. The idea that we must go back to the early church to find a kind of unity that we can imitate, that's a myth. Diversity in the Middle Ages, even though there was one major church, it was very diverse and there were all kinds of movements in that church and on the edges of that church. A major split between Christianity in the East and Christianity in the West in 1054. And of course there were some specific things that caused that split, but it was long in the making because there was quite a diversity in the way Christianity was lived in the Western countries with the increasingly Latin language and in the Eastern Church based on the Greek language. Reformation came, Lutherans, Zwinglians, Calvinists, Anabaptists, and all kinds of smaller movements on the edges of the Reformation. And subsequently, in Protestantism, there has been an enormous fragmentation. we don't know how many denominations there actually are today in the world. Some say that it's a little more than 10,000, and some people think that it's even as many as 20,000 different denominations. Many small, yes, but also many large with names that we have never heard of. Diversity in Protestantism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, the Radical Reformation and the free churches that have some connection with that kind of origin. Then, of course, we have the Anglican community, Methodists, Baptists, a group of other denominations, movements, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Adventists, that all originated around the same time. Modern Pentecostalism that started around 1900, and there are, well, more Pentecostal groups and churches than I think we can count. They are very diverse and split into many different churches. And then there are the indigenous churches, and I think there is a spelling mistake there. Indigenous should be I-N-D-I. But the churches, for instance, in Africa, the African churches sometimes originated in the Protestant churches that were established, but sometimes they are more based on the African original religions, nature religions, and some of these churches have millions of adherents. So there is an enormous diversity also in Protestantism. But also within every, or practically every denomination, there is diversity, intra-denominational diversity. In most denominations, you have different streams. There are conservatives, there are people who call themselves middle-of-the-road people, and then you have liberals or progressives, or whatever you want to call them. We have in Adventism at least these three streams, though some people say that we have even more streams in Adventism than just these three, but it's clear that there is a lot of diversity within denominations. If we look at today's Adventism, and that is really the basis for what we're going to talk about tomorrow, in the worldwide church, we see a great degree of unity. Organizationally, we have unity, uniformity often in the methods that we use and the policies that we have. The number of policies, of course, is increasing all the time. I remember that the General Conference policy book was about 100 pages, and now it's about 1,000 pages. And there is a major degree in the Adventist Church in theology. Now, we need to qualify that a little bit as we go along, but there is a greater degree of unity in our church than there is in many other denominations. But having said that, there is also an enormous amount and a growing amount of diversity. There is a diversity, you might say, between liberal and conservative, but I would argue that the difference is actually greater between modern and postmodern. Now I realize that the term postmodern is a bit fraglich. while many people think that we have actually left postmodernism behind us, we are in something like meta-modernism or something like that, but still there are different ways of thinking, and it was interesting to see that also demonstrated in the Andacht just a little while ago. And it's very difficult for these different ways of thinking to actually harmonize. We are often speaking at cross purposes and are not really listening to the other group. But the diversity is also geographically. The enormous difference between the church in the north and the church in the south. And with the south, I mean the developing world. There was a time when 100% of all Adventists lived in North America. Around 1920, the moment came when there were as many Adventists in North America as there were outside of North America. Today, 6% of all Adventists live in North America. And percentage-wise, it is becoming more and more, just a few percent in the Western world, and the largest percentage in the non-Western world. And of course, we see that when we have a general conference session. We see that in all kinds of large meetings. We see that in the composition also of, for instance, the leadership at the general conference. More and more, the Western Church is a minority. And that has enormous consequences also for the church in Europe in particular, because even though we are a small group, that small group is somewhat strengthened by the arrival of many people from the south. I'm talking about immigration. And that is bringing a certain vitality to some of the churches in Europe, but at the same time, it is also causing quite a few tensions, because in many cases, the immigrants bring a type of church that we had left behind some 50 years ago. So that is quite complicated. And when you look, for instance, at France, you look at England, and you see how the indigenous church has dwindled, and the percentage of the immigrants has increased all the time, then you think, where are we going? How can we live together? Or is it going to be more and more fragmented and diverse? And this can become very, very complicated. I talked to somebody from Denmark last week who told me that, because Denmark never had colonies, like Switzerland, you know. So you don't get large migration from former colonies as the British and the Dutch and the French do. But the government of Denmark decided that they were going to allow a certain contingent of people to come from a certain area in Congo, to come to Britain. Mostly single women, or I should say single mothers. Among that particular group, they came from an area in Congo that is quite heavily populated by Adventists. And so in that group are 200 Congolese women with children that have come to Denmark, Adventist. You can imagine that if you have a church of about 3,000 members, that is quite a challenge to deal with that. In the Netherlands, just a few years ago, we had 4,000 members. That's about the same as you have here, I understand. in Switzerland. Now we have 6,000 members. That's great, you know, that is quite a growth. But they're mostly from South America and the Caribbean. It's good to see this vitality because it brings some life, but at the same time, it changes the church. And it becomes very difficult for some people to actually recognize their own church. So, when we look at today's Adventism, yes, there is a lot of unity, fortunately, but there is also an enormous amount of diversity. There has always been diversity, we should remember. When we go back a little bit, there was already great diversity in the Miller movement. The Miller movement was part of a broader revival movement in the 19th century, in the 30s and 40s of the 19th century. Miller himself was a Baptist. His followers came from all kinds of different denominations: Baptists, Reformed, Methodists, Episcopalians, Christian Connection. That was an interesting group, the Christian Connection, and many of these people later became Seventh-day Adventists, and even some Roman Catholics were part of the Miller movement. Quite a diverse group. They had in common interest in apocalyptic prophecy. Christ was coming. They set a date, the soon return. That was the focus of their movement. And other than that, there was a great variety in doctrines. So the Miller movement, from which we grew, was a very diverse movement. And the early Adventist church, before there was even a Seventh-day Adventist denomination, the time of Sabbatarian Adventist, as we call it, from 1844 to 1863. There were many different ideas floating around. It was not, sometimes people say we should go back to early Adventism because then everything was okay. There was actually a very great diversity in the early form of Adventism. Some people believed in the shut door, others did not. The idea that after 1844, actually it was no longer possible for people to be converted. Those who had positively answered the message of 1844, they were going to be saved. The others would not have a chance to be saved. There was discussion, for instance, on when to begin the Sabbath. It was only gradually that the main doctrines started to emerge. And when we go into Adventist history a little further, for instance, in the 1888 time, there was a major an important general conference in 1888 in Minneapolis about a key element of our faith, legalism versus saved by grace. These things came to a what do you call that? A confrontation, yes. And there were many different ideas, and they state they were being promoted by different people for a very long time. The development of fundamental beliefs, that was not overnight. That took a long time before we came to where we are today. Some of you may be baptized when we had still 22 fundamental beliefs. I was baptized and said yes to 22 fundamental beliefs. So I'm lucky. I can just pick and choose as long as I have 22 fundamental beliefs. But there has always been the discussion as to what exactly is now part of the fundamental beliefs of the Adventist Church and what is not. There were differences always in prophetic interpretation. Even early on, James White and Uriah Smith did not always agree on how particular passages in Daniel and in the Revelation should be interpreted. There were different views about organizational issues. And of course, as Adventism spread around the world, there were so many cultural differences that, diversity increased further. Now, I have had the privilege to see much of that diversity. So you don't have to convince me that Adventism is a diverse church. Done a lot of traveling in Europe, but I lived in Africa for 7 years and have been to almost all African countries. But one of the most exciting times was actually around 1993 when I spent a month in California. And I decided that I would go, I had 4 Sabbaths, and would go to 4 different churches. And they could not have been more different. The Loma Linda University Church, the Campus Hill Church, not that far away from there, totally different church, an ethnic church, and I went to a celebration church. There were some celebration churches at that time, and I remember I was almost crushed by a very big woman, and it was an interesting experience. But that is apparently part of celebration. But you know, you think, okay, this is in one and the same country. This is in an area that is not that big, and you have that kind of diversity of Adventism. I worked in the TED as the secretary of the division for a number of years, and at that time we were dealing also with Pakistan. Pakistan was part of our division. And my boss, the president of the division, did not like Pakistan. So he never went there, and he always told me that I had to go there and try to fix some of the problems there. But we also had the Middle East, Egypt, and Jordan, and different places, Sudan. And so it was a period in which we had, at that time, 39 different countries. And that was really an example of diversity. My own role in the Netherlands, I had to deal with a lot of diversity there. After my retirement started, I was asked to fill in for a year and a half in Belgium. They couldn't find a conference president, and so they decided to get somebody from the Netherlands. And anyway, it proved to be a very interesting period. But now, I think the church in Switzerland is quite diverse because you have different languages and so on. But when you take Belgium, that's probably the most diverse Adventist community that you can think of. We have about 3,000 members in Belgium. First of all, they speak either Dutch or French. That is the Belgians. But then, apart from those 2 groups, you have African churches that speak Kinyarwanda, or Twi, or English. And you have a number of Spanish-speaking churches, a number of Portuguese-speaking churches, and you have a few Russian groups, and you have nowadays Ukrainian groups, and you have a few more groups. It's unbelievably how ethnically diverse that church is. And so when we had pastors' meetings, and I still go there from time to the pastors' meetings, it's in English because that's the only language that most of the pastors can communicate in together. So all these different experiences have really convinced me that our church is terribly diverse. Now, a few basic observations. As I mentioned, there is a unity in our teachings, well, at least to some extent, and there's all kinds of things we can say and will say about that. There is a certain amount of unity in our worship forms. We have Sabbath school, for instance, in most places in the world. There is a unity in organizational forms. We have unions and conferences, and we have a church manual, etc., etc. And when you compare that to some other world churches, we are doing well. When you look at the Calvinists in the Netherlands, they used to say if you have one Dutchman, you have a theologian. If you have two Dutchmen, you have a church. If you have three Dutchmen, you have two churches. And so there is an enormous diversity within the Calvinist world. When you look at the Lutherans, the Lutheran World Federation has 140 different Lutheran denominations that are a member of the Lutheran World Federation. And the Baptists, they have 219 different denominations that are member of the Baptist World Alliance. And now some of these names, Baptist churches, you may not have heard of: the Two-Seat in the Spirit Predestinarian Baptists. That's quite a mouthful. But they are very different. Some are free will Baptists, and others that believe in predestination, etc., etc. And as I mentioned, there's an enormous amount of diversity among the Pentecostals. So even though we can be somewhat satisfied that we have remained together quite well as a church, we have not had major schisms, except of course the Reformed Adventists that separated from us, and they are still a different denomination today with about 40,000 members. But we have not had many different splits. But current Adventism shows increasing diversity, and many people feel, and maybe some of you feel, that maybe it would be better if we had maybe a split with two different denominations, because it is sometimes difficult for groups to stay together. This diversity, some people think it's good that we have diversity, at least to some extent. Others say it's a great danger. And that is certainly at this moment the idea, the opinion of the leadership of the General Conference. There it is felt that this diversity is something that is wrong and that we must fight against, and we must make sure that everybody says yes to the same 28 fundamental beliefs in exactly the same way. So the challenge is, and that is what we will discuss further tomorrow, how can we maintain unity while respecting diversity? And well, this is just a short presentation to lay the basis for what we are going to do tomorrow. Thank you very much.